In a tight-knit community, a single incident of bias at a local diner triggers an unforeseen series of events. The longtime proprietor commits a serious mistake by denying service to a respected veteran. As the veteran departs, hurt by the prejudice, the owner believes the issue is resolved, but he couldn't be more mistaken. Unbeknownst to him, his actions have drawn the notice of someone capable of confronting the town's ingrained biases. What ensues will astonish everyone and impart a profound lesson about forgiveness and transformation. But first, you will have 7 days of good luck if you like and subscribe within 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. And don't forget to subscribe. John Carter let out a weary sigh as he eased his aging body out of his trusty old pickup truck. His joints creaked in protest, reminders of the years he'd spent serving his country. The warm southern sun beat down on his weathered face as he gazed up at the faded sign of Tom's Diner. A small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. He'd been coming to this place for years, drawn by the promise of good food and friendly faces. As John pushed open the door, the familiar jingle of bells announced his arrival. The aroma of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, making his stomach growl in anticipation. He shuffled towards his usual spot at the counter, nodding politely to the other patrons as he passed. But something felt different today. The usual hum of conversation seemed to die down as he entered, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. John could feel eyes on him, watching his every move. He tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, chalking it up to his old soldier's paranoia. As John settled onto a stool at the counter, he noticed Tom Harris, the diner owner, emerge from the kitchen. Tom's face, usually creased in a welcoming smile, was set in a hard, unfriendly line. His eyes, cold and distant, bore into John with an intensity that made the old veteran shift uncomfortably in his seat. "What can I get for you today, John?" Tom's voice was gruff, lacking its usual warmth. John, choosing to ignore the change in Tom's demeanor, smiled kindly. "Just the usual, Tom. A cup of coffee and a slice of that famous apple pie of yours." Tom's jaw clenched, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the counter. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, John. We're all out of pie today." John's brow furrowed in confusion. He could clearly see a freshly baked apple pie sitting on the counter just a few feet away. "But Tom, I can see. I said we're out." Tom's voice rose sharply, causing several patrons to jump in surprise. "In fact, we're closing early today. You'll have to leave." A heavy silence fell over the diner. John sat frozen, struggling to process what was happening. In all his years coming to Tom's Diner, he'd never been treated like this. The other customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some averting their eyes, others watching the scene unfold with a mix of shock and morbid curiosity. John slowly stood up, his weathered hands trembling slightly. "Tom, I don't understand. Have I done something to offend you?" Tom's face twisted into an ugly sneer. "You've done plenty just by walking in here. I don't serve your kind in my establishment. Now get out before I have to call the authorities." The words hit John like a physical blow. He stumbled back, his eyes wide with hurt and disbelief. For a moment he was transported back to his youth, to a time when such treatment was all too common. But this was different. This was Tom, a man he'd considered a friend for years. As John made his way to the door, his shoulders slumped in defeat. A young woman at a nearby table stood up. "This isn't right," she said, her voice shaking. "You can't treat him like this." Tom rounded on her, his face flushed with anger. "This is my diner, and I'll run it how I see fit. If you don't like it, you can leave too." The woman hesitated for a moment, torn between her desire to stand up for what was right and her fear of confrontation. In the end, she sat back down, her eyes filled with shame as she watched John shuffle out of the diner. As the door closed behind John, the diner erupted into a flurry of whispers. Some patrons hurriedly paid their bills and left, unwilling to support such blatant discrimination. Others stayed, either agreeing with Tom's actions or too shocked to move. Little did Tom know, his act of prejudice would set in motion a series of events that would shake the very foundations of their small town. If only he had known who John Carter really was and the powerful connections he had, he might have thought twice about his actions. But as it stood, Tom Harris had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and the consequences were about to come crashing down on him like a tidal wave. As John Carter slowly made his way back to his truck, his mind was reeling from what had just transpired. The warm sunlight that had felt so comforting earlier now seemed to mock him, highlighting the stark reality of the prejudice he had just faced. He climbed into his vehicle, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. For a long moment, John sat there, staring blankly ahead, the hurt and humiliation washing over him in waves, threatening to drown him in despair. But then, almost imperceptibly, something changed in his demeanor. His jaw set in determination, and a fire kindled in his eyes. John Carter was many things: a veteran, a father, a respected member of the community, but he was not a man to take injustice lying down. As he started the engine, John's mind was already working, formulating a plan. He may have been kicked out of Tom's diner, but this was far from over. Little did Tom Harris know, but his actions today would set in motion a chain of events that would change everything in their sleepy little town. Meanwhile, back at the diner, Tom Harris was feeling the immediate backlash of his actions. Several regular customers had walked out, some shooting him disapproving glares as they left. But Tom stood his ground, his face set in a stubborn scowl. He'd done what his father would have wanted, what he believed was right. So why did he feel this gnawing sense of unease in the pit of his stomach? As the day wore on, word of what had happened at Tom's diner spread through the town like wildfire. People gathered in small groups on street corners and in front yards, their voices hushed as they discussed the shocking incident. John Carter was a well-known and respected figure in the community. Many couldn't believe that Tom, who had always seemed so friendly, could harbor such deep-seated prejudice. But there was one person in particular who, when he heard the news, felt a rage unlike anything he'd experienced before. Michael Carter, John's son, was sitting in his office in Washington, D.C., when he received the call from a family friend back home. As he listened to the account of what had happened to his father, Michael's grip on his phone tightened until his knuckles turned white. Michael Carter was not just any concerned son. He was a powerful U.S. senator, known for his work on civil rights and veterans issues. He had fought tirelessly to create a more just and equal society, and now his own father had been subjected to such blatant discrimination. The irony was not lost on him, and it only fueled his determination to right this wrong. As he ended the call, Michael sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He could use his position, his influence, to bring the full force of the law down on Tom Harris. He could make an example of him, show the world that such behavior would not be tolerated. But as tempting as that was, Michael knew that such actions often only served to deepen divides and breed more resentment. No, this situation called for a different approach. Michael leaned forward, picking up his phone again. He had some calls to make, some favors to call in. Tom Harris had no idea what was coming his way, but Michael was determined to teach him a lesson he would never forget. As the sun began to set on the small southern town, casting long shadows across the streets, the stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the community to its core. The actions of one prejudiced man were about to collide head-on with the determination of a son fighting for his father's dignity. And when the dust settled, nothing would ever be the same again. What happened next would shock everyone in town and teach a powerful lesson about the consequences of prejudice. But before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories of justice and redemption. The next morning dawned bright and clear, but there was a tension in the air that seemed to crackle like electricity. Word of John Carter's treatment at Tom's diner had spread far and wide, and the town was abuzz with speculation about what would happen next. Tom Harris arrived at his diner early, as he always did, to start the day's preparations, but as he approached the front door, he noticed something was amiss. A small group of people had gathered outside, holding signs that read, "No to racism," and "Equality for all." Tom's face flushed with anger as he pushed past them, unlocking the door with trembling hands. Inside, Tom tried to go about his usual routine, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming. He jumped at every jingle of the bell above the door, half expecting to see John Carter or the police walk in. But as the morning wore on and nothing happened, Tom began to relax. Maybe, he thought, this would all blow over soon. But Tom's relief was short-lived. Just as the lunch rush was beginning, the bell above the door jingled once more. Tom looked up, and his heart nearly stopped. Standing in the doorway was a man he didn't recognize, but there was something about him that commanded attention. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with an air of authority that made Tom instantly wary. The stranger made his way to the counter, his eyes scanning the diner before settling on Tom. "Are you Tom Harris?" he asked, his voice calm but with an underlying edge of steel. Tom nodded, unable to find his voice. The stranger's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied Tom's face. "I'm Michael Carter," he said, and Tom felt his blood run cold. "John Carter's son. I believe we need to have a conversation about what happened here yesterday." Tom's mind raced. He had heard rumors that John had a son who was involved in politics, but he had dismissed them as small-town gossip. Now faced with the reality, Tom felt a flicker of fear, but his pride and deeply ingrained prejudices quickly squashed it. "Look," Tom said, his voice gruff, "I don't know who you think you are, but this is my establishment. I have the right to refuse service to anyone I choose." Michael's expression remained neutral, but there was a dangerous glint in his eye. "Is that so?" he said softly. "And on what grounds did you refuse service to my father, a decorated veteran who has lived in this town longer than you've been alive?" Tom's face flushed red. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he spat. "Your father and people like him aren't welcome here. End of story." A hush fell over the diner. The other patrons watched the exchange with a mix of horror and fascination. Michael Carter stood perfectly still, his gaze never leaving Tom's face. When he spoke again, his voice was low and controlled, but filled with a quiet fury that made Tom take an involuntary step back. "Mr. Harris," Michael said, "I had hoped we could have a rational discussion about this, but I see now that won't be possible. So let me be very clear. What you did yesterday was not just morally reprehensible, it was illegal, and I intend to use every resource at my disposal to ensure that you face the consequences of your actions." Tom's bravado faltered for a moment. "What? What do you mean? You can't do anything to me." "This is my business," Michael smiled, but it was a cold, hard expression that held no warmth. "Oh, Mr. Harris," he said, "you have no idea who you're dealing with. I'm not just John Carter's son, I'm a United States Senator, and I've dedicated my career to fighting against exactly the kind of bigotry you displayed yesterday." The color drained from Tom's face as the full impact of Michael's words hit him. He had kicked out the father of a U.S. Senator, a man with the power to make his life very, very difficult. "This isn't over," Michael said, turning to leave. "You'll be hearing from me again very soon." As the door closed behind Michael, the diner erupted into a flurry of whispers. Tom stood frozen behind the counter, the realization of what he had done and who he had angered finally sinking in. He had thought he was standing up for his beliefs, for the values his father had instilled in him, but now faced with the consequences of his actions, Tom began to wonder if those beliefs were worth the price he might have to pay. Little did Tom know, but Michael Carter's visit was just the beginning. The wheels of justice were already in motion, and Tom's world was about to be turned upside down in ways he could never have imagined. The small southern town was about to become the center of a storm that would challenge long-held prejudices and force everyone to confront the darkness that lurked beneath their peaceful facade. As Michael Carter's polished shoes clicked against the sidewalk outside Tom's diner, he pulled out his phone and made a call. "It's done," he said tersely. "He's exactly as stubborn and prejudiced as we thought. Time to move to phase 2. Inside the diner, Tom Harris was a man on the edge. His hands shook as he tried to pour coffee for a customer, spilling half of it on the counter. The weight of what had just transpired bore down on him like a physical presence. He had always seen himself as a good man, a pillar of the community, but now faced with the consequences of his actions, doubt began to creep in. As the day wore on, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that his whole world was about to come crashing down around him. Every time the bell above the door jingled, he flinched, half expecting to see federal agents or lawyers storming in. But it was worse than that. Instead of the dramatic confrontation he feared, Tom was met with something far more insidious: the quiet judgment of his community. Regular customers who had been coming to his diner for years now avoided his gaze, some not showing up at all. Those who did come in were subdued, their usual friendly chatter replaced by awkward silences. Tom could feel their eyes on him, could almost hear their unspoken condemnation. As closing time approached, Tom slumped into a booth, his head in his hands. The diner, usually bustling with the dinner crowd, was eerily empty. For the first time, Tom allowed himself to consider the possibility that he might have made a terrible mistake. Meanwhile, across town, John Carter sat in his modest living room, surrounded by old photographs and mementos from his time in the service. He picked up a framed picture of himself and his late wife, taken on the day he returned from the war. They both looked so young, so full of hope for the future. "Oh, Margaret," he said, running a finger over her smiling face, "what would you say if you could see what's happening now?" The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke John from his reverie. A moment later, the front door opened, and Michael stepped in. Father and son embraced, the unspoken pain of recent events hanging heavy between them. "How did it go?" John asked as they settled into their chairs. Michael's jaw clenched. "About as well as we expected. He's not going to change his mind easily, Dad. But don't worry, we have a plan." John nodded slowly. I never thought it would come to this. Tom and we weren't close friends, but I always thought we had a mutual respect. To find out that all this time he saw me as less than human because of the color of my skin. It hurts, son. It hurts deep." Michael leaned forward, taking his father's weathered hand in his own. "I know, Dad, and that's why we can't let this stand. What happened to you? It's not just about you. It's about every person of color in this town, in this country, who still faces discrimination every day. We have to take a stand." John looked at his son, seeing in him the same fire, the same determination to fight for justice that had driven him in his youth. He felt a swell of pride, tinged with a hint of sadness. This wasn't the world he had hoped to leave for his son, but he was grateful that Michael had the strength and the position to fight for change. "What's the next step?" John asked, his voice stronger now. Michael's eyes gleamed with a mix of determination and something else, a hint of a plan that was already in motion. "Well, Dad, that's where things get interesting. You see, I've done some digging, and it turns out our friend Tom is in a bit of financial trouble. His diner isn't doing as well as he'd like people to think. In fact, he's been trying to sell it for years." John's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Sell the diner? But it's been in his family for generations." Michael nodded. "Exactly, which is why he's been so reluctant to let it go. But after today's incident, I think he might be more open to the idea, especially if the right offer comes along." John leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed in thought. "What are you planning, son?" Michael's smile was both determined and a little mischievous. "Let's just say that Tom Harris is about to receive an offer he can't refuse, and when the dust settles, that diner is going to become a symbol of something very different than what it represents now." As night fell over the small town, the seeds of change had been planted. Little did Tom Harris know, but his world was about to be turned upside down in ways he could never have imagined. The coming days would test the very fabric of the community, forcing everyone to confront their own biases and preconceptions. The next morning, Tom arrived at his diner earlier than usual. He had slept, plagued by nightmares of angry mobs and legal summons. As he unlocked the front door, he noticed a thick envelope that had been slipped under it. With trembling hands, he picked it up and tore it open. Inside was a formally looking document, and as Tom's eyes scanned the contents, his face grew pale. It was an offer to buy his diner for nearly twice its market value. The offer was anonymous, made through a law firm he didn't recognize. At the bottom of the letter was a note. "This offer is time-sensitive and contingent upon your immediate departure from the premises and agreement not to open another business in the area." Tom's mind reeled. Who would make such an offer, and why now? As much as he hated to admit it, the diner had been struggling for years. The thought of selling had crossed his mind more than once, but he had always pushed it away, clinging to the legacy his father had left him. But now, faced with the potential fallout from his confrontation with John Carter and his son, the offer seemed like a lifeline, a way out of the mess he had created. Yet something about it felt off. The timing was too convenient, the conditions too specific. As Tom stood there, lost in thought, the bell above the door jingled. He looked up to see Sarah, his longtime waitress, walk in. The moment she saw him, she stopped short, her expression guarded. "Tom, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Tom quickly shoved the letter into his pocket. "I'm fine," he said gruffly. Just a lot on my mind." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and disappointment. "Tom, about yesterday, what you did to Mr. Carter. It wasn't right. A lot of people are talking about it. They're saying they won't come back to the diner." Tom felt a surge of anger. "It's my diner. I can serve who I want." Sarah flinched at his tone, and Tom immediately regretted his outburst. He ran a hand through his graying hair, suddenly feeling every one of his years. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I didn't mean to snap at you. It's just, everything's falling apart, and I don't know how to fix it." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Maybe you could start by apologizing to Mr. Carter. It's not too late to make things right." Tom's jaw clenched. The thought of apologizing to John Carter went against everything he had been raised to believe. His father's voice echoed in his head, filled with bitterness and prejudice. But for the first time, Tom found himself questioning those long-held beliefs. As the day progressed, the diner remained eerily quiet. The usual lunch rush never materialized, and Tom found himself with far too much time to think. The letter in his pocket seemed to burn, a constant reminder of the decision he faced. Across town, Michael Carter was in a meeting with a group of community leaders. The room was filled with a mix of anger and determination as Michael laid out his plan. "What happened to my father is not an isolated incident," Michael said, his voice steady but filled with passion. "It's a symptom of a deeper problem in our community, but we have an opportunity here to turn this into a catalyst for change." An older woman, the head of the local NAACP chapter, leaned forward. "What exactly are you proposing, Senator?" Michael smiled. "We're going to buy Tom's diner." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. "Buy it?" someone asked. "Why would we want to do that?" "Because," Michael explained, "we're going to transform it into something new, a place that brings people together instead of dividing them, a symbol of unity and progress right in the heart of our town." As Michael outlined his vision, the energy in the room began to shift. Skepticism gave way to excitement as people began to see the potential in his plan. Meanwhile, John Carter sat on his front porch, lost in thought. The events of the past few days had stirred up memories he had long tried to forget. He closed his eyes, and suddenly he was back in the jungles of Vietnam, surrounded by the chaos of war. In his mind's eye, he saw again the face of Tom Harris Sr., his fellow soldier and friend. They had fought side by side, relying on each other to survive in a world gone mad. But then came that fateful day, the day that changed everything. John remembered the new recruit, a young black soldier fresh out of basic training. He had been scared, overwhelmed by the brutality of war, and in a moment of panic, he had made a fatal mistake. A mistake that cost the lives of several men, including Tom Sr.'s best friend. The grief and anger that followed had poisoned Tom Sr.'s mind. He had turned that pain into hatred, blaming not just the young soldier, but all black people for his loss. John had watched helplessly as his friend was consumed by bitterness, unable to see past his pain to the larger truth. That war was the real enemy, not the color of a man's skin. As John opened his eyes, returning to the present, he felt a deep sadness. He understood now where Tom Jr.'s prejudice came from. It was a legacy of pain passed down from father to son. But understanding didn't make it right. And John knew that if there was ever going to be real change, the cycle had to be broken. Back at the diner, Tom was closing up for the night when he heard a knock at the door. He looked up to see Michael Carter standing outside. For a moment, Tom considered pretending he hadn't seen him, but something in Michael's expression made him pause. With a heavy sigh, Tom unlocked the door. "We're closed," he said, his voice gruff. Michael nodded. "I know. I'm not here as a customer, Mr. Harris. I'm here to talk." Tom hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside to let Michael in. The two men stood in the empty diner, the weight of history and prejudice hanging heavy between them. "I know about the offer you received," Michael said without preamble. Tom's eyes widened in surprise. "How did you?" "It doesn't matter," Michael cut him off. What matters is what you're going to do about it." Tom's shoulders slumped. "I don't know," he admitted. "This place, it's all I have. It's my father's legacy." Michael's expression softened slightly. "Is it really the legacy you want to uphold? The legacy of hatred and division?" Tom flinched at the words, but he couldn't deny their truth. For the first time, he allowed himself to truly question the beliefs he had held for so long. "What do you want from me?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael stepped closer. "I want you to make a choice, Mr. Harris. A choice to be better than your father, to break the cycle of hatred and start anew." As Tom looked into Michael's eyes, he saw not judgment or condemnation, but a glimmer of hope. And in that moment, something shifted inside him. The walls he had built around his heart began to crumble, and he felt the first stirrings of change. Little did Tom know, but his decision in this moment would set in motion a series of events that would not only transform his life, but the entire community. The path ahead would not be easy, but it held the promise of redemption and healing for a town long divided by the shadows of the past. As the sun rose on a new day, Tom Harris stood outside his diner, keys in hand. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to do. With a trembling hand, he unlocked the door and stepped inside for what he knew might be the last time. The familiar smell of coffee and grease hit him, bringing with it a flood of memories. He remembered his father standing behind this very counter, teaching him how to run the place. He could almost hear the echo of laughter from happier times before bitterness and prejudice had poisoned everything. Tom made his way to the office in the back, sinking heavily into the creaky old chair behind the desk. He pulled out the offer letter, reading it over one more time. Then, with a deep sigh, he picked up the phone and dialed the number at the bottom of the page. "This is Tom Harris," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm calling about the offer to buy my diner. I accept." As Tom hung up the phone, he felt a strange mix of relief and sadness wash over him. It was done. The diner that had been in his family for generations would soon belong to someone else. But along with the sadness, there was also a glimmer of something else. Hope. Hope for a fresh start, a chance to be better than he had been. Across town, Michael Carter's phone buzzed with a text message. He read it quickly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It's done," he said to his father, who was sitting across from him at the breakfast table. Tom accepted the offer. John Carter nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "And now?" he asked. Michael's smile grew wider. "Now, Dad, we start phase 2 of the plan. It's time to transform that diner into something that will bring this community together, instead of tearing it apart." Over the next few weeks, the town buzzed with activity and speculation. The news that Tom Harris had sold his diner spread quickly, and rumors flew about who the new owner might be. Some said it was a big chain restaurant coming to town, others whispered that it was being turned into a fancy coffee shop. But the truth, when it was finally revealed, shocked everyone. It was a sunny Saturday morning when the newly renovated diner was unveiled. A crowd had gathered outside, curious to see what changes had been made. At the stroke of noon, the doors swung open, and gasps of surprise rippled through the crowd. Standing in the doorway, a warm smile on his face, was John Carter. "Welcome, everyone," John said, his voice strong and clear. "Welcome to the veteran table." The crowd murmured in confusion and surprise. John Carter, the very man who had been kicked out of this diner just weeks ago, was now its owner. John stepped aside, inviting everyone to come in and see for themselves. As people filed in, they were greeted by a completely transformed space. The walls were adorned with photographs and memorabilia from various wars, honoring veterans of all races and backgrounds. The booths had been reupholstered in a deep blue reminiscent of military uniforms, but the most striking change was the large mural on the back wall. It depicted a diverse group of soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces etched with determination and camaraderie. At the center of the mural were two figures, a young black soldier and a young white soldier, their arms around each other's shoulders. To those who knew the story, the resemblance to young John Carter and Tom Harris Sr. was unmistakable. As people took in the changes, John made his way to the center of the room. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice filled with emotion, This diner has long been a fixture in our community, but it has also been a symbol of division and prejudice. Today we change that. Today we turn it into a place of unity, understanding, and healing. John went on to explain that the Veteran Table would be more than just a restaurant. It would be a community hub, a place where veterans could come for support and where people of all backgrounds could gather to share meals and stories. There would be regular events focused on promoting understanding and breaking down barriers. As John spoke, the crowd's initial shock gave way to enthusiasm. People began to nod, some wiping away tears. The atmosphere in the diner shifted, filled with a sense of hope and possibility. But there was one more surprise in store. As John finished speaking, he gestured towards the kitchen. "And now I'd like to introduce you to our new head chef." The kitchen doors swung open, and a hush fell over the crowd. Standing there, wearing a crisp white chef's uniform, was Tom Harris. Tom stepped forward, his eyes downcast, his shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. But when he finally looked up, he was met not with anger or judgment, but with a sea of curious faces. I know I'm probably the last person you expected to see here," Tom began, his voice shaky. "And I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. What I did, what I believed, it was wrong. Deeply, terribly wrong." Tom's voice grew stronger as he continued. "But John and Michael Carter have given me a chance I don't deserve. A chance to learn, to grow, to be better than I was. And I promise you I will spend every day trying to earn the trust they've placed in me." The diner fell silent as Tom's words sank in. Then slowly, someone began to clap. Others joined in, and soon the room was filled with applause. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was acknowledgement of the difficult journey Tom was undertaking and the courage it took to admit his mistakes publicly. As the applause died down, John stepped forward again. "This is what the Veteran Table is all about," he said. "It's about second chances. It's about healing old wounds and building a better future together. And I hope you'll all be part of it." With that, John declared the diner officially open. As people began to mingle, sampling the food and exploring the new space, there was a palpable sense of change in the air. Old barriers were breaking down, conversations were starting, and a community was beginning to heal. In the kitchen, Tom worked alongside his new staff, a diverse group of people he would never have considered hiring before. He felt a weight lifting from his shoulders with each meal he prepared, each smile he received. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in years, he felt hope. Meanwhile, John and Michael Carter stood back, watching their vision come to life. "Do you think it will work, Dad?" Michael asked quietly. John smiled, his eyes twinkling. "It's a start, son, a good start, and sometimes that's all you need to change the world." As the day wore on, the Veteran Table buzzed with activity. People who had never spoken to each other before were now sharing tables, swapping stories, and finding common ground. The walls that had divided the community for so long were beginning to crumble, one conversation at a time. In the weeks and months that followed, the Veteran Table became more than just a diner. It became a symbol of hope and transformation for the entire town. Regular events brought people together to discuss difficult topics, bridging divides that had existed for generations. Tom Harris, true to his word, worked tirelessly to earn the trust of the community. He listened, he learned, and he changed. Slowly but surely, people began to see him not as the prejudiced man he had been, but as a testament to the power of redemption. The story of the Veteran Table spread far beyond the borders of their small town. News outlets picked up the story, amazed by the transformation of both the diner and its former owner. A documentary filmmaker even approached John and Michael about telling their story to a wider audience. But perhaps the most powerful moment came nearly a year after the diner's reopening. Tom Harris Sr., who had been living in a nursing home in another state, came to visit, wheelchair-bound and frail. The elder Harris was a shadow of the strong, bitter man he had once been. As John wheeled him into the diner, Tom Sr.'s eyes widened in shock. He took in the mural, the diverse crowd, his son working happily alongside people he would have once despised. And for the first time in decades, Tom Harris Sr. began to cry. "I was wrong," he whispered, grasping John's hand. "All these years I was so wrong." That day, surrounded by the warmth and unity of the Veteran Table, old wounds began to heal. Tom Sr. shared stories of his time in the war, not with bitterness but with a newfound perspective. He spoke of the fear, the chaos, the shared humanity of soldiers on all sides. As the sun set on that remarkable day, John Carter stood outside the diner, looking up at the sign that now read, "The Veteran Table." He thought about the long journey that had brought them to this point. The pain, the struggle, the moments of doubt, all of it had led to this transformation. Inside, the diner was still buzzing with activity. Through the window, John could see Tom Sr. surrounded by a group of veterans, both young and old from various backgrounds. They were listening intently as he spoke, nodding in understanding and offering words of support. John felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Michael standing beside him. "You did it, Dad," Michael said softly. "You changed everything." John shook his head, a gentle smile on his face. "We did it, son, all of us together." As they stood there, watching the scene inside the diner, neither of them could have imagined the ripple effect their actions would have on the wider world. But the story of the Veteran Table was far from over. In fact, it was about to enter a new chapter that would touch lives far beyond their small southern town. The next morning, as John was preparing to open the diner, he received an unexpected call. It was from a producer at a national news network. They wanted to do a feature story on the Veteran Table and the remarkable transformation it had sparked in the community. At first, John was hesitant. He hadn't done any of this for recognition or fame. But as he thought about it, he realized that sharing their story could inspire others to take similar actions in their own communities. With that in mind, he agreed to the interview. The day the news crew arrived, the entire town seemed to be buzzing with excitement. People gathered outside the diner, hoping to catch a glimpse of the cameras and maybe even get interviewed themselves. Inside, John sat at one of the booths, the mural of diverse soldiers serving as a powerful backdrop. As the interview began, he spoke from the heart about the incident that had started it all. The pain of facing such blatant discrimination, and the decision to respond with love and understanding rather than anger. It would have been easy to respond to hatred with more hatred, John said, his voice steady and clear, but that would have only perpetuated the cycle. Instead, we chose to see this as an opportunity for growth and healing. The reporter then turned to Tom Harris, who had joined them at the booth. Tom's hands shook slightly as he began to speak, but his voice grew stronger as he shared his story of transformation. "I was raised with certain beliefs," Tom said, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, "beliefs that I now know were wrong. It took this experience and the incredible grace shown by John and Michael Carter to open my eyes. I'm not proud of who I was, but I'm working every day to be someone I can be proud of." As the interview progressed, other members of the community joined in, sharing their own experiences of how the Veteran Table had changed their perspectives and brought people together who might never have interacted before. The reporter, clearly moved by the stories she was hearing, asked John what message he hoped people would take away from their experience. John thought for a moment before responding, "I hope people will see that change is possible even in the face of deeply ingrained prejudices. It's not easy and it doesn't happen overnight, but with patience, understanding, and a willingness to see the humanity in everyone, we can build a better world." As the news crew packed up their equipment, there was a sense of anticipation in the air. Everyone knew that once their story aired, things might never be the same again, and they were right. The feature story aired on a Sunday evening during prime time. As millions of viewers across the country tuned in, they were captivated by the tale of a small southern town's journey from division to unity. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded with reactions, phone lines at the network were flooded with calls, and the Veteran Table became a trending topic overnight. In the days that followed, the diner was inundated with visitors from all over the country. People drove for hours, even days, just to see the place for themselves and experience the atmosphere of acceptance and healing that had been created there. But it wasn't just curious tourists who were drawn to the diner. Community leaders from other towns and cities began to reach out, eager to learn how they could implement similar programs in their own areas. John and Michael found themselves fielding calls and emails from people all over the country, seeking advice on how to bridge divides and promote healing in their communities. The impact of their story reached even further than they could have imagined. A group of filmmakers approached them about creating a documentary, not just about the Veterans Table, but about the larger issues of prejudice, forgiveness, and community healing. As filming began, John, Michael, and Tom found themselves revisiting the events that had led them to this point. It wasn't always easy. Reliving some of the painful moments brought back difficult emotions, but it also reinforced how far they had come and strengthened their resolve to continue their work. The documentary crew followed them for months, capturing the day-to-day operations of the diner, the community events they hosted, and the ongoing process of healing and growth. They interviewed townspeople, veterans who had found a home at the Veterans Table, and even some of those who had initially been skeptical of the changes. One of the most powerful moments came when they interviewed Tom Harris, Sr. The elder Harris, his health declining but his mind sharp, spoke with raw honesty about the roots of his prejudice and the transformative power of the love and forgiveness he had experienced. "I carried so much anger for so long," Tom Sr. said, his voice weak but his eyes clear. "I let one terrible moment in war define how I saw an entire group of people. But being here, seeing what my son and John have built together, it's opened my eyes. I only wish I had learned this lesson sooner." As the documentary neared completion, word of its production spread, creating even more anticipation. Major film festivals expressed interest in premiering it, and there was even talk of Oscar potential. But for John, Michael, and Tom, the true measure of success wasn't in accolades or recognition. It was in the small, everyday changes they saw in their community and in the stories they heard from people who had been inspired by their example. One evening, after a long day of filming, John sat at the counter of the Veterans Table, nursing a cup of coffee. The diner was quiet, the last customers having left for the night. Tom was in the kitchen cleaning up, while Michael sat nearby going over some paperwork. "You know," John said, breaking the comfortable silence, "when all this started, I never could have imagined where it would lead." Michael looked up from his papers, a smile playing on his lips. "You mean you didn't envision becoming a national symbol for community healing and racial reconciliation?" John chuckled, shaking his head. "Hardly. I just wanted to stand up for what was right, to show that love could overcome hatred." Tom emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel, and said, "Look what that stand has created," gesturing around the diner. "You've changed so many lives, John. Mine, most of all." John reached out, clasping Tom's shoulder. "We've all changed, Tom. That's the beauty of it. We're all on this journey together." As they sat there, the three men, who had once been on opposite sides of a deep divide, now united in purpose, they couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the path that had brought them here. Little did they know, their journey was far from over. The release of the documentary would catapult their story onto the world stage, inspiring movements for change and reconciliation in ways they had never dreamed possible. But that, as they say, is another story. The premiere of the documentary, titled Table of Brotherhood: The Veterans Table Story, was held in a packed theater in New York City. John, Michael, and Tom found themselves walking the red carpet, an experience none of them had ever imagined. As they took their seats in the darkened theater, surrounded by film industry elites, civil rights leaders, and media personalities, they felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. How would their story be received by this diverse, worldly audience? The film began with the incident at the diner, pulling no punches in its depiction of the ugly reality of racism. Many in the audience gasped audibly at Tom's initial treatment of John, but as the story unfolded, showing the transformation of both individuals and the entire community, the mood in the theater shifted. By the time the credits rolled, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. The applause was thunderous and sustained. As John, Michael, and Tom made their way to the stage for a Q&A session, they were greeted with a standing ovation. The questions from the audience were thoughtful and probing. One viewer asked John how he had found the strength to forgive Tom. John paused before answering, his voice filled with emotion. "Forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened. It's about choosing to not let hatred consume you. It's about seeing the humanity in everyone, even those who have wronged you. It's not easy, but it's necessary if we want to move forward as a society. Another audience member asked Tom what he would say to others who held similar prejudices to those he once had. Tom took a deep breath, his hands gripping the podium tightly. "I would tell them that holding on to hate only hurts yourself. It blinds you to the beauty of human diversity and the richness of experiences you can have when you open your heart to others. I wasted so many years in anger and fear. Don't make the same mistake I did." The impact of the documentary was immediate and far-reaching. It was picked up for distribution by a major streaming service, making it accessible to millions of viewers worldwide. The story of the Veterans Table sparked conversations about race, reconciliation, and community healing in living rooms, classrooms, and boardrooms across the globe. But perhaps the most significant impact was felt closer to home. In the months following the documentary's release, the Veterans Table became a pilgrimage site of sorts. People from all over the country and even from abroad came to see the diner for themselves, to experience the atmosphere of acceptance and healing that had been created there. John, Michael, and Tom found themselves in demand as speakers at conferences and events focused on community building and racial reconciliation. They shared their story tirelessly, always emphasizing that what they had achieved was possible anywhere with commitment and compassion. The diner itself continued to evolve with the influx of visitors. They expanded their operations, always maintaining the focus on veteran support and community healing. They started a mentorship program pairing veterans with at-risk youth in the community. The program was a resounding success, providing guidance and support to young people while giving veterans a renewed sense of purpose. As the months passed, the impact of the Veterans Table began to ripple out in unexpected ways. Other communities, inspired by their story, began to create their own versions of the diner. From small towns in the Midwest to big cities on the coast, people were coming together to address long-standing divisions and work towards healing. One day, about a year after the documentary's release, John received a call that left him stunned. It was from a prominent national civil rights organization. They had seen the documentary and were deeply moved by their story. They wanted to invite John, Michael, and Tom to their annual conference to discuss their experiences and share their insights on community healing and racial reconciliation. The day of their visit to the conference was surreal. As they walked through the halls filled with civil rights leaders and activists, John couldn't help but think of how far they had come from a small-town diner to a national stage. Their journey had been extraordinary. Their presentation at the conference was both humbling and inspiring. The audience listened intently as they shared their story, asking thoughtful questions and expressing admiration for what they had achieved. "What you've done," the organization's president said, "is provide a roadmap for healing in communities across our nation. You've shown that change is possible, even in the face of deep-seated prejudice and historical divisions." As they left the conference, the organization announced that they would be establishing a national initiative inspired by the Veterans Table to promote community healing and racial reconciliation across the country. John, Michael, and Tom were asked to serve as advisors to the program. The news of the conference and the new initiative brought renewed attention to the Veterans Table. News crews descended on the small town, eager to capture the reaction of the community to this latest development. But amidst all the excitement and media attention, John, Michael, and Tom remained focused on the work at hand. They knew that true change didn't come from grand gestures or national recognition, but from the day-to-day efforts of individuals committed to making a difference. Back at the diner, life went on. Veterans continued to find solace and support within its walls. Community members from all walks of life came together over meals, sharing stories, and bridging divides. And Tom, once the face of prejudice in the town, continued his journey of growth and redemption. One evening, as the sun was setting and the last customers were leaving, John found Tom standing in front of the mural, lost in thought. "Penny for your thoughts?" John asked, coming to stand beside him. Tom was quiet for a moment before responding. I was just thinking about my father, he said softly, about how proud he would be of what we've accomplished here, and how sad he would be that he wasted so many years in anger and bitterness. John nodded, understanding the complex emotions Tom was grappling with. Your father's journey, like yours, is a powerful reminder that it's never too late to change. His story is part of what makes this place so special. As they stood there looking at the mural that depicted soldiers of all races standing together, they heard the door open behind them. Turning, they saw Michael enter, a look of excitement on his face. "You're not going to believe this," Michael said, waving a letter in his hand. "We've been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize." John and Tom exchanged shocked looks. The Nobel Peace Prize? It seemed almost unbelievable that their small-town diner could be considered for such a prestigious honor. "The nomination cites our work in community healing and racial reconciliation," Michael continued, reading from the letter. "They say we've provided a model for addressing deep-seated societal divisions in a peaceful and transformative way." As the news sank in, John felt a mix of emotions wash over him. Pride in what they had accomplished, humility in the face of such recognition, and a renewed determination to continue their work. "Well," John said, a smile spreading across his face, "I guess we'd better get back to work. We've got a lot more healing to do." Tom nodded in agreement, while Michael chuckled at his father's understated reaction to such momentous news. As they locked up the diner that night, the three men couldn't help but reflect on the incredible journey that had brought them to this point. From a single act of prejudice to a movement that was changing lives across the nation, the Veterans Table had become so much more than just a diner. It was a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of forgiveness, and a living example of what can be achieved when people come together to heal old wounds and build a better future. As they walked out into the quiet night, the neon sign of the Veterans Table glowed warmly behind them, a symbol of the light they had brought into a world often darkened by division and hatred. The story of John Carter, Michael Carter, and Tom Harris was far from over. In fact, in many ways, it felt like it was just beginning. With each life they touched, each community they inspired, and each barrier they broke down, they were writing a new chapter in the ongoing story of America's journey towards true equality and understanding. And it all started with a simple act of forgiveness in a small-town diner. If John Carter, Michael Carter, and Tom Harris's story touched your heart, share it with someone who could use a little inspiration today. I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions on the story. Make sure to leave them in the description below for anyone to see. If you liked this video, please make sure to go ahead and leave this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you don't miss out on any of my future videos. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.